this new episode of our ongoing series Basic Notions of Metaphysics, we'll talk about univocal concept of being. Now, at the outset, I'll have to make few distinctions. Namely, Basic Notions of Metaphysics series is focused on what is called traditional metaphysics. That is to say, metaphysics that has some propositions and features that are not really present anymore in modern age, or even, as we shall see in this podcast, before modern age. And a univocal concept of being, in my opinion, very humble opinion, because this is a very difficult subject and I'll just give an outline of the problem. Univocal concept of being, namely, is not a notion of metaphysics in the sense I consider something to be basic notion of metaphysics. In fact, I would be so bold to claim that univocal concept of being is a basic notion of modern metaphysics. And modern metaphysics and traditional metaphysics are, in my opinion, not really opposed as two contraries or true contradictions, or even, as one might infer, positive or negative of something, as modern metaphysics would be a downright negation of traditional metaphysics. This is not how things work in history of ideas and in history in general. Or let's go the furthest and say in reality things don't go in that clear-cut way. Modern metaphysics is, I would say, a kind of drift from the origins of metaphysics, and drift and moving away in a particular direction, and a kind of dispersion of the essence of metaphysics and the meaning of metaphysics, which ends up in the present age in which we live. But this age is not modern age anymore, and what we now might call metaphysics is not modern metaphysics. It is a veritable negative of all metaphysics, which has many manifestations from post-humanism, sustainable development, all kinds of technological system theories, and so on and so forth. But for the sake of brevity, we won't be able to go too much into this now. I just wanted to put this remark to, let's say, clarify things a bit before we proceed, because really univocal concept of being cannot be put in a same sentence even as being, as a reality, as it is understood by Thomas Aquinas. The difference between traditional notion of being and univocal notion or concept of being is a difference, in my opinion, between heaven and earth. It's something that is worlds apart. So I mentioned Thomas Aquinas not by accident, because univocal concept of being is usually and rightly tied to the name of John Duns Scotus, British or Scottish, and some even say maybe Irish philosopher from late 13th, early 14th century. He died very young. He died I think in the first decade of 14th century, and it is very often put in a kind of critical opposition to Thomas Aquinas. This is not really true. Duns Scotus had written critical works on so-called Thomists of his own age, who already kind of drifted away from the original, not simply Thomas Aquinas's metaphysics or doctrine, but I would even venture to say from this traditional understanding of metaphysics. Now, not to keep you in dark anymore, if you are a newcomer to Kali Tribune, I'll explain what I think exactly by these traditional notions of metaphysics. And I will refer here to my previous podcast in this series Analogia Entis, because there you have a kind of more or less exhaustive explanation of what I mean by kind of a traditional understanding of being as reality or being as act or being as ἐνέργειᾰ, which is not present anymore with univocal concept of being. I'll just reiterate quickly. So, originally or traditionally, being, and please bear this in mind, being is not a concept. There are all kinds of reasons, all of them good ones, why it is not concept. What boggles the mind sometimes, especially in modern and postmodern men, is that being is nevertheless understood in some way. It is intelligible in some way, yet it is never a concept. Univocal concept of being is precisely what it says on the tin. It is a concept. For Duns Scotus, being is concept. For Aristotle, for Plotinus, for Proclus, for Meister Eckhart, for Thomas Aquinas, and numerous others, being is not a concept. Being is reality. What kind of reality and how we approach this reality, and can we at all approach this reality, is a different and separate question. But important thing to bear in mind at the outset is that being is not a concept. We can have concept of being, of course. We must have it in order to talk about being in general. And I have to use some kind of concept now when I'm making this podcast. But the primary instance, that is the subject of metaphysics, as scientia transcendens, is not concept. In Duns Scotus, it is. Now, how that came to pass? Let's say at the outset what it means for some notion to be univocal. I'll put it in the context of three ways to use the same word and same notion correspondingly to express different beings or different things. First would be equivocity. If I say, for instance, that this is a man, for instance, Branko is a man, meaning me, and let's say, for instance, painted image of man is a man. Let's say I see the painting of human features and point my finger and say, this is a man. I use the same word to describe or to denote or to point out realities that have no inner connection. So there is no inner connection between actual man and painted man. There can be, mind you, metaphorical connection, but this is a separate issue. And I refer you once again to my podcast on Analogia Entis, because I have something to say about these things. So in terms of traditional metaphysics from Middle Ages, so for scholastics, high scholastic metaphysics, this is purely accidental as opposed to substantial connection between name, concept, and a thing. Things are completely disparate, and only by accident do we call them by the same name. we don't express the same reality. The other notion would be analogical, as it became known in Middle Ages, and this is the notion according to which two different things are spoken as one, as sharing something in common, so far as they can be called by the same name and be predicated the same essential quality. And this is what Aristotle called proshen legomena, things said according to one, or things said according to first instance. And that was a famous example of health, when he says that we say healthy features, healthy body, healthy complexion, healthy animal, all, or healthy procedure, all are in accordance to one instance, that is the health itself, or healthiness itself. So everything is spoken of in a different degrees of coming close to the original reality of health, original actuality or act of being healthy. As you can see already, there is an inner connection. And what confuses people, and what confused people even in the Middle Ages, and one generation after Thomas Aquinas, as much as I can see, is, I think, this word analogy, because originally this was not called analogy, as I said, in Greek, traditional Greek metaphysicians. Maybe in Neoplatonics later, but analogy kind of implies four terms. This is different kind of analogy. This is in fact a causal relationship of participation. And upon this, for instance, traditional understanding of being is being built upon, because being is the first instance of everything. That is to say, everything can be spoken as participating in being in some way. And this is what connects all different beings that exist. Now, of course, I'm being very sparse here because this is not a subject of the podcast, but I'll return to this subject later in full, because it is very important to make a contrast between this participatory understanding of being and the concept of being. Namely, what is participated in analogy is not a concept. So, for instance, when we talk about so-called names of God, and this is the original place where the doctrine of analogy, for example, in Thomas Aquinas, was developed, in commentary on divine names by Pseudo Dionysius Areopagita. The main problem is how you use qualifications or predications about God and predications about creature in a way that these created things predicated have something in common with uncreated things predicated. How, for instance, God's wisdom can have any semblance to human wisdom, something that is completely different. Well, the thing is that, as Aquinas would ingeniously put it, God has wisdom essentially, whereas man has wisdom by participation. And mind you, it's very interesting, this human wisdom, which participates in some kind of way in divine wisdom, as an effect participates in cause, is autonomous thing. It is different. It is infinitely different than God's wisdom. This is very important to understand. So this is not a concept. These are different realities. And this, between created and uncreated, there is infinite difference and infinite distance, which is in fact interesting, because the distance is infinite because paradoxically the original, the essential, the uncreated is ever present in created, because it cannot be it has to be ever present, because it is what creates the created. And creative act of God is not being understood as some kind of something that happened in the past and it's over. It is a continuous, we can imagine it as continuous, but in its essence it will be a kind of eternal instance of keeping things in existence. So it's ever present, but also by its very ever presence inconceivable. What we conceive is the likeness of this act, and we know that it is the likeness of the original, although we cannot conceive the original. And this is something that kind of like makes people who want to have conceptual systems crazy, because upon this you cannot build a system. When somebody tells you that Aristotle or Aquinas or Plato had system, shoot the man. Sorry, he's wrong. And I say this and I repeat this oftentimes because you can read works of excellent scholars in philosophy who just don't see this. This is very important to understand, because this is how you differentiate the fundamentals, and the fundamentals in a very obvious sense, but also in the sense which is very easy to oversee. And then you have completely wrong conclusions. I believe that something like this happened with Duns Scotus and his univocal notion of being, not in the sense that I'm condemning Scotus for something here. He's very difficult thinker, and I don't consider myself to be such an expert to say something like this. But what happened to him with the univocal concept of being is that he just couldn't, for some reason, couldn't see the reality of this energetic energetic reality, in fact, of being you have in Aquinas, where, in fact, talking of being in general, these metaphysical, supposedly abstract terms are, in fact, a series of like theophanies, where in every being you see this revelation of God's creative act. And this was normal. For instance, it's so normal for Aquinas that he, for instance, very rarely reflects upon it explicitly. So it's very easy to miss it, because this is the natural kind of like reality, intellectual reality in which he moves. This also applies to many other philosophers, even from pre-Christianity. You can see this thing. But in some, as we shall see, we don't see this. So we come at last to the univocal concept of being. Now, what is univocal concept of being? When I say Branko is a man and Socrates is a man, the notion of man, the concept of man, is univocal in both guys. Me and the great Greek. God rest his soul. So this is univocality. We are members of same species and same genera. We share definition. We have not only connection, but we are in respect to our nature one. So in this way, in for instance, in natural world, univocal concept of being is univocal concepts are ever present, because causal relations that are expressed in predication. For instance, that one animal begets the animal of the same species. This makes both of these animals obviously univocal concepts of these animals, or concepts of these animal natures, let's say. This is univocal concept of being. But how to put this in metaphysics? And this was something that Duns Scotus intended to do. Now, he missed one very important point. Now, his debates, not explicit debates live, but debates through books with some of the so-called Dominican Thomists, were about this notion of analogy that he couldn't accept. And people think that these were critiques of Thomas Aquinas, but they weren't, because their understanding of Thomas Aquinas, that is to say those so-called followers of Aquinas, was already completely distorted. And mind you, this is not something I'm saying like kind of one guy who had a light bulb eureka moment and understood this, but this is something that is already common knowledge in the scholarly world, at least in Europe. I don't know, for in German speaking and some Dutch scholars I read, but it is very obvious when you read the original works, because you always have to read original works, obviously. Only a real objection that Scotus has on Thomas Aquinas is what reveals his kind of like misstep, or even changing of direction, that leads metaphysics into modernity. He says the metaphysics and human mind must have the proper object. The proper object of mind or intellectus is being. Being is the first notion of intellect. Now, this is something that Thomas Aquinas also says, but with quite a different meaning. For Thomas, being is the first thing that falls upon intellect. But by this, he doesn't mean concept of being. He means being as act. Greek word ἐνέργειᾰ, translated appropriately as actus in Latin. Everything that is primarily an act. So the first thing that hits you, that hits the intellect, every intellect, is being, because being is common to all. The actuality is the first that is present in all beings, and it bears fruit in something that Thomas calls ens universalis, the one common beingness of all, which is, as he says, first created thing. Not in the sense that God created some kind of substrate, abstract substrate called being, and then all other beings fell upon it to have something to stand on. That would be matter. But this is not it. The being is first created, because being is ever present in this permanent act of creation, ever present act of creation. When you say that you have being, in Thomas Aquinas, for instance, you have two things which are one, which can be distinguished, which are really distinguished, but also united in this distinction. Those are the essence, this is the nature, which, for instance, you and I as men or women have. For instance, my essence is that I'm a human being, and act of being. Act of being is this ἐνέργειᾰ, and it is primary. Act of being is what makes this nature real. So nature is something that contracts this act of being to this particular unique instance. The being in general is the commonality of not only of these acts of beings, but of all of that. Commonality in the sense that everything that is is composed of nature or essence and the act of being. And the thing that unites them, making them real and unique, is God's act. It's the fact that they are created. The act of creation. And this is being. This is the first thing that hits the mind. But it is not, and this is where the problem begins for Duns Scotus. This is not a concept. This is not something you know. This is the first thing to know, but initially it doesn't have to be known. Why? Because, as Thomas says, all human knowledge must first come through senses. This does not mean that being is something that is sensible primarily. It is not. It transcends sense. It is in fact intellectual not in a sense that it is a notion, but in the sense that it is non-material. That is, although it imbibes even the matter, everything that is can be called being because it is present in it. But it is not a concept, it is not primarily understood. It is what you acquire by the second act, but by the act of resolution, which is translation resolutio of Greek word analysis, into it, because you can resolve everything into being. And this means primarily in Thomas Aquinas, you can resolve every effect into its actual cause, every potentiality or partial actuality in the pure ἐνέργειᾰ of being. You cannot comprehend it because of its pureness, but you can comprehend everything else in its light. And metaphysics, the object, being as object of metaphysics, means that metaphysics is a science, scientia transcendens, science of all things in the light of this first instance that unites them. You cannot turn it into concept, you cannot focus on it, but you have to resolve everything in it. Everything is given in its light, and he really uses the image of light to describe it. I talked more about this in my previous already referred podcast. Namely, so this is being is the proper object of intellect. Duns Scotus says the same thing, but he objects to Thomas Aquinas that for him the material substance, sensible substance, is the first object of intellect, and this is wrong. This is not true. Material substance, that is to say substance of being that can be perceived, is not the proper object of human knowledge, but the first object of human knowledge in temporal sense. This is the first things you know, first things you encounter, because we are bodily corporeal creatures. But through them, you, through perception, through understanding of what is material, you come to what is not material. You come back to their causes. And this is something that Scotus skipped in Thomas. So what he wants is the pure concept of being. He thinks that metaphysics is impossible if we don't have the pure concept of being. And this concept of being has to be univocal. And now I'll give you a definition. There are few arguments he gives, so very simple arguments about why being is univocal. Quote Duns Scotus from his Ordinatio. I designate that concept univocal which possesses sufficient unity in itself, so that to affirm and deny it of one and the same thing would be a contradiction. This is simplicity itself. Now, what it means by this? Well, he wants to say that every notion you have, every two notions you have, for instance, created and uncreated, can be in oppositions. Let's say created being and uncreated being. Those are for him two concepts. What do they have in common that you cannot erase? Being. I can doubt whether human being is created or uncreated. I can doubt about the nature of uncreated being, that is God. One thing I cannot doubt in both of those concepts is the concept of being itself. Now, note one extremely important thing. Doubt. Anybody with experience in philosophy can already notice something from quite later age than late 13th, early 14th century, namely 17th century and René Descartes. Doubt is very important for him also to find the first principle that he found in consciousness and its relation between finite and infinite consciousness, in very late scholastic terms, mind you, but that's a story in itself. This is, in my opinion, inception of modern approach, because nothing of this sort you can find before in Thomas, in Eckhart, in Aristotle, anybody of them. It may seem, and it did seem to people like Scotus that was the case, but it wasn't. They don't use this argument from subjectivity. In order for Duns Scotus to come to the univocal notion of being, he has to employ this element of a relation of this concept to the one who creates the concept, that is to say, human being. And this is the inception of modern philosophy. The univocal concept of being is completely simple. This means that it doesn't have any of the attributes it is present in. So, in this example of created and uncreated being, nothing pertaining to created or uncreated can be present in being, in univocal concept of being. It is pure and simple. And you might ask yourself what kind of concept that is so pure and simple that it doesn't have genera and species, because every concept is built upon genus proximum and differentia specifica, approximate genus and specific difference. So when I have a concept of man that is a rational animal, let's say an intellectual animal or intellectual living being, we have a synthesis of animality and intellectuality. And all concepts are like that. In concept of univocal concept of being, there is none of that, because it has to be completely simple. And Duns Scotus, alas, calls it a transcendental concept. Now, about transcendentals I spoke very often before. I'll just remind you on one thing, if you're following Kali Tribune. If not, I'll say this first. You'll hear this first time. Transcendentals, as the most universal modes of being, are not concepts. So when being, about which we are talking all the time, when Thomas, for instance, says that being is transcendental, or even when Albertus Magnus, Albert the Great, says being is transcendental, what he means is reality. When he says the truth is transcendental and convertible with being because it has the same extension, it is being in the mode of truth. It is kind of like further specification of truth, but of being, but being as reality. We of course make concepts about this so we can talk about it, but I would say that when you talk about things like transcendentals, like pure reality of ἐνέργειᾰ and so on, you're already using even concepts as a kind of symbols. Because all those things transcend concepts for a simple reason, or for many reasons, but the simplest logical and ontological reason is that they transcend genera. There is no genera of being, because every genera must be contracted by species. Nothing can contract being, because being is present in everything. The only thing outside being is non-being, which has nothing to do with being, obviously. And as you can see, I believe, in Duns Scotus, the difference comes to pass, where this all becomes conceptual. And this, I would add, gives rise to possibility of creating a system of concepts. One very important feature of modern metaphysics is that it is systematic metaphysics. It's 6 systems. You cannot have the system of ἐνέργειᾰ, of being that is reality, created reality, and that is recognized as created reality. Because it is higher than the mind itself. Why Thomas insists on, for instance, on this sensual experience as the first, as something we cannot escape from. 2 things. First, because he's Christian, and this is important because this highly differentiates him from Plato and Aristotle, who would say much the same thing at the outset. Even Plato, mind you, not only Aristotle. That all knowledge comes first through experience, and then you revert to what is before sensible. In Aristotle, to causes, in Plato also in causes, but also in intelligible forms and so on. But in Thomas, the very important thing is this Christianity of his. God created man in body, as embodied, and man in the present state, in statuisto, as they would say in Middle Ages, is not man in his original form. Our senses are not subordinated to higher principles, but are running amok, running wild. We are fallen creatures. And this is the only way, but this remains the only way how we come to knowledge. In the heavenly state or original state of man, this knowledge came in a different form and more immediate and with different consequences. But in this life, we have to do with what we have. This is very important. This is the first thing. And the second thing is that reality of being, into which, after a long process of reversion from these effects into causes, into invisible principles of reality, which are the first by nature in the process of cognition, but not first in time, in succession, you cannot turn them into kind of system of concepts, because you have to recognize that you are below them on ontological and metaphysical scale. They are higher than us, so we can never comprehend them in the conceptual sense, in the sense that we could externalize them, because conceptualizing something in the systematic form is externalizing. It's a kind of reification, as they say sometimes in philosophy. When you take something, for instance, that is live, dynamic, thinking, and so on, and turn it into something which is static and frankly dead. In what they say, turning things into abstraction. And this is the verdict on philosophy very often, but this is the verdict that was acquired very recently, in fact, in modern age, at the dawn of modernity. This is the feature of modern metaphysics, because modern metaphysics does this. And we'll finish on this note one more feature of univocality, which is very important. Univocal concept of being does not recognize hierarchy. And traditional metaphysics is, bar nothing, absolutely based on hierarchy and hierarchical notions. Nothing is equal to anything else. Excuse me, in traditional metaphysics, nothing. Mind you, let us turn to an example of Duns Scotus for univocal concept of being. Created being and uncreated being are equally being. So this concept is indifferent, and Duns Scotus uses this word, indifferent. It is unifying disparate beings, making them one only by its indifference. And this means that in conceptual sense, when you work on univocal concept of being, on the basis of univocal concept of being, there is no hierarchy of being initially. Hierarchy is secondary, something that you acquire only later in different ways. I don't think it works at all. I think that once you start from this notion, you kind of end up with flat and indifferent notions. So you have system in which you have man, you have angels, and you have God. But they are all concepts. This is not something that really, and now I'll have to be subjective, cannot touch you intimately, cannot really move anything. Let us repeat once more. This was not the only thing that Duns Scotus was famous for, and this is not to condemn him, because there are other philosophical works of his, philosophical accomplishments, and even more theological accomplishments that kind of like are not related to this notion. But this one notion is what is famous for, and I think that this notion is very dangerous. It is not, you couldn't say that he's really wrong in the sense that there is no univocal concept of being. He is wrong only if he thinks that there is a univocal being. Because in traditional metaphysics, being is reality, of which you make concept, not the concept. And if Duns Scotus understood it only as a concept, okay, let's say this is valid. But if he thought that there are only concepts, then we have a problem, because then we have hundreds of years later Gilles Deleuze, who is using this notion of his in his own interpretation to prove that there are no hierarchies, in his project of establishing difference before being, and postmodernity. What can I say? It would be too far now to go into explicating that, but suffice it to say, you have a situation where there is no higher or lower, there is no better or worse, there is no more beautiful than ugly, and so on and so forth. And most of all, there is no more being and less being, which is something, not in quantitative sense of course, which is a mainstay of traditional metaphysics. It is a necessity. And as I said, in my opinion, this is in fact the inception of modern philosophy. But as we are hitting our 45 minutes mark, I think this will suffice for this time. Thank you for your attention. This was Branko Malic of Kali Trivium signing out.